Hi, I'm Ken. Let's take a look at some of my German stamps today. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Germany was put under control of the Allied forces and divided into 4 administrative zones managed by France, Great Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. Thank you to Wikipedia for this public domain map that I've used as a base. I'll put my shaded copy on my blog for you to refer to later. I've shaded the French area in blue, the British in light purple, the American in dark purple, and the Soviet section in pink. There's also a yellow section on the northern coast of the British section that was jointly managed by both the British and Americans. The other oddity is this green shaded section in the middle of the Soviet administrative zone. This area is Berlin, which was itself divided into 4 sections, each administered by one of the 4 allies. The AM post stamps on this page were jointly issued in 1945 by the US and Great Britain to cover civilian postage from within their 2 administrative zones, the areas I've shaded in light and dark purple. I'll talk about what postage was used in the other zones shortly, but for now let's dive into these issues. They are surprisingly difficult to collect. First, to look at the design. The AM stands for Allied Military, and the M in the center of the design just stands for military, all rather dull and counter to the normal patriotic and propaganda goals of postage stamps. Well, that's kind of the point with these. The then released regular issue stamps featured a leader they didn't want to continue to feature. These were obviously not allowed for postage. The other available issues featured National Socialist themes, which were also not appropriate going forward. Instead, these boring designs were released to fill the need while not stirring any nationalist pride. There are 3 different printings for these issues, which can be a little difficult to tell apart. Scott is pretty bad at explaining the differences, but it can be easy once you know what to look for. The first issues were printed in the US in Washington, D.C. in 1944 before the end of the war, and shipped to the German lines to be ready when needed. I'm struck by the careful planning and project management this required. To be ready to solve this postage need so quickly is amazing. It reminds me just how important the role postage stamps play in cementing political changes. These stamps were actually first issued in Aachen, Germany in March 1945 after American forces captured that city, the first German city to fall in the war, even though the war wouldn't officially end until May of that year. What a treasure it would be to find a cover with these issues, or any stamps really, dated between their first issue in March until the end of the war, VE Day, on May 8, 1945. The US printings of these stamps are listed in Scott as the lowercase a versions of these stamps, 3N2A through 3N13A. I'll explain why in a moment. The second issues were printed in London. Scott lists these as the lowercase b versions of the stamps, 3N2B through 3N8B. These were intended for use across both the US and British administrative zones. Finally, the third set was printed in Braunschweig, Germany, also known as Brunswick. The set includes expanded values from 1 Pfennig to 1 mark. The values between 30 and 80 Pfennig were issued in a larger format, with the 1 mark stamp issued in a still larger format. These Braunschweig issues are the first major catalog listings in Scott, primarily, I presume, because they cover the full range of values for the series, despite being the last stamps issued in this set. Now for how to identify these 3 different printings. I'll give a shout out to Wikipedia, in particular the German Wikipedia page, for this helpful public domain image that shows the differences. I'll leave this image on my blog with a link to the German Wikipedia article. And of course, these images are in a different order altogether from the order they were printed. Oh well, it's a good order for the explanation. The easiest stamps to tell apart are the London printings. They're perforated a little bigger than 14. The Z annotation at the bottom of the stamps on the picture show the actual perforation. The Z stands for Zonung, which is German for perforation, in case you were wondering. The other 2 printings are perforated in the 11 range, although perhaps a little too close to use that perforation difference to be sure of which one was which. Of course, all 3 printings use slightly different inks, paper, and gum, and therefore have slightly different looks and feels. I tried to tell them apart this way, but that's just too hard. Unfortunately, it's the only hints Scott gives you to figuring these guys out. There's an easier way, though. The German printing has extra detail in the scroll work. That's highlighted in the circled areas in the image. That extra white space in the design is very easy to see with a magnifying glass. It's as simple as that. First, check the perforations for the Perf 14 London printing. Next, check for the extra detail in the scroll work. The one with the white space is the German printing. Finally, the Perf 11 printing without the white space is the US printing. I'll put up a blog post with both my table of issues and the identifier image so you can refer to it later. As you look at my page, you'll see that I have some that are mint and some that are used. This is a great place to point out an oddity of collecting German stamps. For many issues, postally used examples are worth significantly more than mint copies. That's the case for this series. Whenever I have a choice, I collect the postally used copies. Note that I keep saying postally used. While it's not a problem with these stamps, some stamps are available in a format called CTO, or Cancelled to Order. Many East German stamps could be found cancelled to order. The stamp on the left is a CTO. Notice how nicely the cancel is positioned on the corner of the stamp. The one on the right is a postally used copy. Certainly not as pretty, but this stamp actually lived its best life getting mail to somebody. CTO stamps are not postally used. Countries issue stamps this way for collectors so they can sell them without having the possibility that they're used for postage. I personally don't prefer those stamps, but they are better than no stamp. Some people love them, which is also just fine. I also want to point out this 4-pfennig stamp. I've added it to this page because it's misperforated. This is not a big error, but I found it interesting enough to display this copy. Errors like this are kind of fun for me. So that's my AM post issues. They're pretty easy to identify once you know the tricks. I'm still looking for a few, and honestly, if I get the rest of the large value issues, I'm going to have to make another page to fit them. Although it's possible I can cram that last 1-mark stamp in the bottom right corner. We'll see. While the British and American zones were covered by the AM post stamps, the French issued these stamps for use in their administration zone. These are much more interesting than the AM post stamps. They feature coats of arms of regions in the administrative zone, local pride over national pride. There's the Rhine province, the Palatinate district, which is roughly the same as Bavaria. Next is Württemberg, and finally Saarland. Saarland is a slightly special case here. Unlike the other regions, Saarland had been disputed territory between Germany and France. The end of the war didn't really settle that issue, so while Saarland was under French administration, it wasn't really part of France, nor was it officially considered part of Germany. The Saar would remain semi-autonomous until 1957, when after a vote of the people and much wrangling, Saar was reincorporated into Germany. During the period directly after the war, 1945 to 1947, when these French administrative zone stamps would have been in use, these stamps were not really intended for use in the Saarland, despite there being 2 stamps with the Saarland coat of arms on them, although they were sometimes used there. Instead, it seems that the postal system of Saarland used Deutsche Post stamps until they created their own issues in 1947. I'll cover the Deutsche Post stamps in a minute. There were also 3 mark value stamps issued for the French zone at the same time. I don't have any of these stamps. Mint copies are not expensive, although used copies are. They are all vertical format stamps featuring famous German writers, although I can't see that they have any special affiliation with the areas comprising the French administrative zone. These stamps would remain in use in the French zone until 1947, when more localized issues were released. This page holds my stamps from Baden, still a part of the French administrative zone. In 1947, the French issued regional stamps rather than continue with the previous whole zone issues. These Baden issues came out in 3 periods with 3 color variations. I've created 2 pages to hold all these issues, but so far I've only partially filled out this first page. The issues featured scenes and people of regional pride. They come in the common regular issue size and have wide issues for the 3 highest values. I find it interesting that the denomination style for these stamps bounces around a bit. The first issues show the Pfennig denomination abbreviated to PF. In the middle issues, some of the denominations are abbreviated DPF, adding the D for Deutsche. This was done as part of a currency change from the old Reichsmark currency to the new Deutsche Mark currency. Finally, the last release drops the denomination abbreviation altogether. These next issues were for the combined region of the Rhine province and the Palatinate district. You'll notice that these stamps use widely similar designs to the previous Baden stamps. In fact, the denominations and colors for this set are nearly identical to the Baden set, even though the designs on the stamps feature different subjects. This page is the full set of the 1947 Rhineland-Palatinate issues. On the second page of Rhineland-Palatinate issues, I've only got a few of the 1948 issues and none of the third issues without the denomination abbreviations. Finally, I have 2 pages for the Württemberg issues, but still only enough to fill a few spaces on this first page. Again, you'll notice that these stamps have the same designs as the other 2 French regions. Indeed, again, they are almost identical in denomination and design to the other 2 sets. But what about Saarland? This is my album page for the Saar stamps of the same period. I don't have very many of them yet. That's okay, it gives me room to grow my collection. Anyway, I don't group this album page with the other Allied occupation stamps. I might have, but remember, Saar is different from the other regions, despite the fact that these stamps have similar designs to the other French zone stamps issued in the same year. Similar but different. Unlike the other 3 provinces, the Saar stamps have different denominations and different colors, and they don't follow the same 3-release pattern of the other 2. I'll point out, too, that the Saar stamps have ordinary Scott numbers, like a country, rather than the N-style numbers that Scott uses to indicate an occupied zone. Remember, Saar's status was in dispute, and while France was technically administering this region, Saar was not occupied by the French. To the French, Saar was part of France, but that was not politically agreed to by anyone else, including the people of Saar. So Saar was in consideration for, and in many ways was treated like, an independent country, although they would ultimately vote to rejoin Germany in 1957. Despite these stamps looking similar to other French zone stamps of 1947, the stamps of Saar are not even listed in the catalog with the other French zone stamps. In fact, they aren't even listed in the German section, or for that matter, the French section of the Scott catalog. These stamps are listed in the S section of the Scott catalog with regular catalog numbers, along with the other issues from Saar that came out in the aftermath of World War I, when Saar fell under the administration of the League of Nations. This border is a long-standing disputed area, with the population both times opting to be part of Germany. There were other issues for Saar in this period after World War II and before Saar is reunited with Germany, but I don't have any of those to show you. Yet. So let's get back to the occupation issues. Unlike the French, the Soviets went straight to issuing stamps as regional issues. This first page is for the region of Berlin and Brandenburg. This postal area included the jointly administered city of Berlin, which would eventually become the island of West Germany in the middle of East Germany. But in those first few post-war years, these stamps covered the city as well. I just have some of these issues with normal perforations. These also existed with rouletted perforations. I just added one of these to that page. I rescued that one out of that large bag of trash stamps that I've been working through. There is a staggering amount of detail in perforation styles, paper, color, and gum for these issues that I haven't bothered to dive into quite yet. The next stamp set is for the 2 regions along the northern coast, Mecklenburg and Vorpommern. I don't have any of these stamps, so we'll skip that blank page. These stamps are from the Saxony province, simple coats of arms. They come in both perforated and imperforate versions. The catalog lists these stamps as from West Saxony, but that doesn't really seem to be a place. It's the Leipzig area, and I'm going to guess it goes all the way to the western border of the Soviet zone, but I'm really not sure about this one. One hint is that these stamps are labeled Deutsche Post, which is what the reforming German postal system would label itself in this interim period. That suggests some affinity of this region to the wider Germany, but I'm just not sure. Just like the West Saxony stamps, there really isn't a place called East Saxony. This is the Dresden area. These stamps are just the worst, though, particularly the imperforate versions. The printing and paper quality are poor, the design actually barely a design. The only word on the stamp is post, except for the first one that adds the Russian word for post in the bottom of the frame. It's prohibitively expensive for my collection. Even the values leave out the denomination, which is Pfennig, by the way. Imagine being a new collector and trying to identify one of these. I would have assumed they were fake stamps, part of some toy post office kit. The final region in the Soviet zone is Thuringia. There's also a souvenir sheet of 5 stamps that look like regular issue stamps from Thuringia, but remember, I tend to stick to the regular issues. This is not a bad little set and rather inexpensive to collect mint. In 1946, in some measure of increasing autonomy, a German postal system was restarted, issuing stamps labeled Deutsche Post. These stamps were issued for use in the British, American, and Soviet zones. They were not valid in the French zones, although examples exist of them in use, notably in Saarland. Too much bad blood, I'm guessing. It was around that same time that the French issued their regional occupation stamps that we looked at a few minutes ago. Despite the simple design, these stamps have some really lovely colors. These stamps came out with 2 overprint styles starting in 1948. Here's the only stamp I have with one of those overprints. I need to ask for a small amount of patience here. These overprints came out for a reason, but it's difficult to explain that reason without first looking at the rest of the Russian zone stamps. So for now, keep the fact that these overprints exist in your head and we'll come back to it in a minute. In 1947, Deutsche Post issued these stamps featuring various German workers. Note that the higher value stamps feature hands in chains reaching for a dove with an olive branch. These stamps represent Germany reaching for peace. Remember, the war was over, so what peace are they reaching for? These issues also came with 2 overprints starting in 1948. I have a few of these, but not many. Okay, got it? Germany's looking to establish a message of unified government and peace in 1946. These stamps are in use in the American and British and even the Soviet zones in 1946 and 1947, and then something happens in 1948. The Soviets blockaded the city of Berlin. You see, the Soviets saw unification of Germany coming and they wanted nothing to do with that. They wanted to maintain control of the Soviet zones. I would try to give the whole political history lesson, but that's just really going to take too long, except to say that this standoff would ultimately result in the creation of East Germany, leaving Berlin, the city, cut off from the West, a state that would exist until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany starting in 1989. In 1948, after the blockade of Berlin, it no longer made sense for the Soviets to use Deutsche Post stamps. But there was still an immediate need for postage and an existing stock of Deutsche Post stamps available. So the Soviets overprinted that existing stock of stamps with the German words for Soviet occupation zone, indicating that these stamps were no longer valid outside of the Soviet zone and making it possible to disallow use of stamps from the American and British zones. Stocks of Berlin stamps were similarly overprinted. Note that this was still officially the Soviet occupation zone. There isn't an East Germany quite yet, but it wouldn't be long. Scott lists these overprint stamps with a new occupation number, 10N, giving these stamps the numbers 10N1 through 10N28. Later that year, the Soviets released these famous Germans stamps. Notice that they still are labeled Deutsche Post, as if this is a takeover play for the whole of the German postal system. These stamps would later be reissued in 1953 by the German Democratic Republic. Largely, the only way to tell them apart is by the watermark. Normally, I would put 2 such similar issues together on the same page, but given that the catalog numbers are from different issuing entities, which I keep in different binders, I decided to keep them separate. The Soviets would issue 3 more stamps, commemoratives, under the auspices of the Soviet Administrative Zone. Those issues would end in the Scott catalog with the number 10N47, to be followed by the first stamp of the newly formed German Democratic Republic, starting with catalog number 48. So that's my collection of post-World War II German occupation zone stamps. It's such an interesting area despite being so complex. The Scott catalog doesn't do a good job either of making it clear the order in which the stamps were issued or even where the various issues were valid. SAR stamps are often their own volume of the catalog. The German numeric issues sit in the middle of the German section without any indication that they are in the use concurrent with the occupation zone issues. The Russian zone stamps are numbered with 10N but come in the catalog at the start of the GDR section, with the Russian zone stamps that came before them listed at the end of that same section, but totally separate from the AM, post, and French zone stamps. And then there's the stamps of Berlin. I talked about the Stat Berlin stamps issued just after the war in the Soviet zone, but after the blockade. Berlin continued to issue its own stamps. Those stamps continue to be listed with the 9N catalog numbers indicating the area was technically an occupied zone until the reunification of Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So these are my two binders of German issue stamps. The first one here, I have stamps that we usually consider to be German stamps. For space reasons, I've also included the World War II occupation zone stamps in that one. The second album has Berlin, East Germany, German states, and all the other territories and occupations that I consider part of any complete German collection. On top of that, there's a number of occupations of Germany during World War II in particular, but also during World War I, that I typically keep with the countries, organized with the countries that Germany occupied. It seems to make more sense to have them in those parts of the album. No, I'm not going to show every stamp of my German collection, but it seems like we've come this far, so I might as well help demystify some of the rest of the structure of German stamp collecting. I created this page as a reference to the various stamp types that could be considered part of a German collection. I've put a copy of it on my blog for reference. It may look complicated, but that's only because it is. But once I walk you through this chart, I think you can handle it. And honestly, we already went through the hardest part with the post-World War II breakup. Let's give that a quick review. We have at the first level the three postal administrations of the occupation zones and the dates they put out issues. Below the French zone, I've listed the 4 regions that issued stamps, with a note on Saarland to see Saar. Below the Soviet zone, I've listed the 6 regions that issued stamps. You might just have to remember from the dates that the joint Soviet zone stamps came after the regional issues. I show the dates of the German post stamps with a note to see the main German section for those. That should give you a hint about that timeline. I also show the end result at the bottom of that section with the formation of West Berlin and the GDR until reunification in the 90s. But let's go all the way back to the beginning. This section shows the broad swaths of German history as reflected in her postal history. The first line shows the period of the German Confederation. Before Germany was a country, it was a confederation of states that would eventually unite to become Germany. I'm mentioning a lot of dates as we go. Don't worry so much about them, there won't be a test. The important part of the dates is the order that things happened in, not the specific dates. Wherever I can, I try to talk about what events were happening as well as talk about the dates. Note that the German Confederation started in 1815. The first postage stamp in the world, the penny black, wouldn't be issued until 1840, so there were no postage stamps in the Confederation when it was formed. But during the period of Confederation, postage stamps would become a normal part of most governments. In fact, the first German postage stamp came out of the state of Bavaria in 1849, 9 years after the penny black. Most of the German confederations would stop issuing their own postage with the formation of the German Empire in 1871. The German Confederation was made up of 17 postal issuing entities. I've got a list of them further down on the page, along with the dates they issued stamps. Again, don't sweat the dates. In some future video, I might show you my collection of those stamps. It's admittedly sparse. I'll share some of my copies for a moment. It's rather unlikely that you get stamps from many of these German states. Some are easier than others, but it's extremely likely that even a beginning collector will come across stamps from Bavaria. It's useful to know where these stamps fit into the story of German stamp collecting. It might be a little difficult to tell without me pointing it out, but there are 2 other things worth noting in this chart. First, the dates for Bavaria and Württemberg are after the 1871 formation of the German Empire. These 2 states maintained their postal autonomy even after the start of the empire. The other thing worth pointing out is that many of the German states consolidated their postal systems under the North German Confederation after that was formed. The North German Confederation postal system gave way to the German empires. Now back to the overview section. The German Empire lasted until the end of World War I. At some point I'll go over my World War I collection, but for now note that there was a global transition from empire to republics after that war. World War I ushered in the Weimar Republic, which continued until the formation of the German Reich by the Nazis in 1934. Obviously, the German Reich was dissolved with the end of World War II. We've already talked through that period directly following World War II. And finally, this index shows the 1990 transition of the seat of government as part of the reunification of the two Germanys. The next part of this story comes during the period of expansion after the start of the empire and before World War I. I don't mean to be casual saying this, but you can think of the rise of empires and global expansion as a fad among Western nations. Germany was no different in this regard than Austria, Great Britain, Spain, France, Italy, or even smaller nations like Portugal and the Netherlands. The United States, while never an empire, was in this game too, with its Western expansion and the concept of manifest destiny. First on this list are the offices in China, Morocco, and Turkey. Germany set up postal administrations and issued overprinted stamps in these three countries. This was also a common practice at the time. These Germania overprints are relatively easy to acquire. There are also overprints of the earlier Eagle and Shield issues, which are more expensive. The other lines on this list are German territories. These are all small islands and countries. Everyone playing the expansion game was making claims for these smaller places, essentially as safer ports for ever-increasing global shipping trade. Nobody was laying claim to large established countries like China or Turkey until the start of World War I. That war seems like a natural extension to the expansion of empires. You can capture a small country with a remote naval force, but to invade a larger country you certainly need shorter supply lines. Most of these small territories started out using overprinted Eagle and Shield stamps, but then moved on to a series used specifically for the territories. The new series used stamps featuring the Kaiser's yacht, the Hohenzollern. They came in many denominations, usually in the local currency. The higher value stamps have a wider format image of the yacht, but these tend to be pricey. They also usually come with and without watermarks. I find these designs to be particularly beautiful. The next phase in German and really world history is the start of World War I, neighbors attacking neighbors. Germany wasn't the first in this war, but they used the conflict between Austria and Serbia to launch their own attacks against France and Russia. World War I would last from 1914 to 1918. In that period, we see the course of the war and the postal history of the participants. In this chart, I show the German occupation stamps that I'm aware of. There are stamps issued by Germany for occupations in Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, France, Belgium, Latvia, and Romania. These stamps are usually overprinted issues, most often on Germania stamps. These seem rightly part of a German stamp collection, but they also seem rightly part of the postal history of the occupied country. As a rule, I include these issues with the album of the occupied country. I list those occupations as a reference here to help me keep track of them. This chart also shows a few places where German territory was occupied. These examples come from captured German territories. Again, these are overprints, typically of the occupying country or neighboring territories of theirs. At the end of the war, in defeat, Germany would no longer hold any of its territories. For my collection, I've included these territorial occupation stamps in my World War I album. I've also included the territorial stamps used during the war in that album. Oddly, I've decided to include the territorial stamps in my German album too, which means I save 2 copies when I can get them to tell that story. This goes against my rule of keeping such stamps with the album of the occupied country. For example, I include British India stamps in my Indian collection. That only makes sense. In most ways, I think of territorial stamps as a type of occupation, despite what the occupiers would have said at the time. My main reason for including the German territories in my German collection is that I don't yet have collections for these territories. When I do, I'm going to have to decide to either keep them here with Germany or collect a 3rd copy of these stamps. I think you all know what I'm going to decide. At the end of the war, there were 3 areas that had been part of Germany that were still in dispute. There's the familiar area of Saar, once again a central conflicted zone between France and Germany. Saar issues during this period are labeled as Saargebiet, but this is the same place we know as Saar and Saarland. For a while, Saargebiet issued its own postage, some lovely issues. In 1935, they voted to rejoin Germany. The other two disputed areas were Allenstein and Marienwerder, together known as East Prussia. These two areas also held a vote on whether to become part of Poland or rejoin Germany. They ultimately decided to rejoin Germany. With German aggression across 2 world wars, there were a lot of occupations. This is the long chart I used to keep track of where to look for those stamps. Here's hoping that this list won't get any longer. I think the only thing left to cover is the part most of you probably already know about, the state of Germany between the end of World War II and the reunification after the fall of the Berlin Wall. During this time, there were 3 stamp-issuing entities making up a German collection. Of course, there's what we just call Germany, or more officially, the Federal Republic of Germany. Their stamps were labeled Deutsches Bundespost during this period. If you had a collection of just Germany, then these stamps would be in that collection. The second issuing entity was West Berlin, that island of Germany in the middle of what had been the Soviet occupation zone. West Berlin didn't use stamps from Germany. It was technically still an occupation zone, and the Scott catalog numbers show 9N throughout the entirety of its existence. Berlin issued stamps unique to Berlin, but they also issued Berlin versions of German Federal Republic stamps. I can miss the little word Berlin if I'm not careful. I think it's worth pointing out one other oddity of Berlin postal history. On most Berlin mail from 1948 to 1956, there was an additional tax stamp. These little blue stamps were not to pay postage. They were an additional tax for social programs in Berlin. It seems right that every Berlin stamp collection should have an example of these, but I know they aren't really postage stamps. The last issuing entity was the German Democratic Republic. I've said it before, if you get confused when there are 2 countries with similar names and one has the word democratic in its name, that's the one that's socialist. It's my Western bias for sure, but anytime a country decides to obfuscate what it is by adding democratic to its name, that's a sign to be wary of them. The GDR put out some really nice stamps. You'll find a lot of them that are canceled to order, so they are used, but not postally used. I personally don't prefer those stamps, but they are clean and inexpensive examples for a collection. There is one series where the CTO version of the stamps are slightly different from the actual stamps. Scott doesn't list these with different catalog numbers, but for my collection I include both those variants. I find it interesting. And with that, we're done with our overview of the structure of German stamps. Remember, I put that summary chart on my blog page so you can reference it later. There's something about the complexity of collecting German stamps that just makes me happy. I think one of the reasons that I collect stamps is to bring order to chaos. And so I encourage you, as you do your own stamp collecting, to go out and reduce entropy.